Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel. So today I want to show you two different opening traps in Sicilian Defense. If you are playing Sicilian Defense as white or as black, I would suggest you to watch this video because this can be useful and you can win your games very quickly, or if you're playing as black, you can avoid such traps. Okay, so let's dive into these games. The first game I want to show you, it's a short game by Bobby Fischer, who was playing as white. So as you know, we have Sicilian Defense after e4 and c5. So I would recommend you to play knight f3, which is the main line here, knight c6, and then you can play d4. Instead of knight c6 here, black has, some options here. Knight c6, d6, e6, even g6 or a6. These moves are playable, but I would say knight c6, d6 and e6, these three moves are more popular than the others. But let's say if black plays knight c6, then you can play d4. Black takes the pawn, you take back with the knight, and then let's say black moves the pawn to g6. This is accelerated dragon. When black fianchettos the bishop on this diagonal, we call it dragon variation. And the reason they call it dragon, because the pawn structure, they say it's like a dragon tail. So let's say if the pawn is on d6, they say it's like a dragon tail here. Okay, I'm not sure if it's like a dragon tail. You guys need to tell me. But anyway, so here after knight c3, let's say black plays bishop g7. Here you can play bishop e3 and knight f6, bishop c4. This move is actually very aggressive, and Bobby Fischer really liked this move, bishop c4, even against d6, which we call it Sicilian attack. So instead of g6, if he plays d6. So if you guys are interested in Sicilian attack, just write me in comment section and I will create another video for you guys. But anyway, bishop c4 is really aggressive, attacking the weakest pawn or weakest square in chess. So black castled here, and white played bishop b3. Okay, here black should play something like d6, which is playable even nowadays. But black made a mistake and he moved the knight to a5. Why? Because black thought, okay, the bishop on b3 is really strong. He wanted to exchange his knight for the bishop, but that was not a good move. Now, what can you do? You can push your pawn to e5, because notice that when the knight was on c6, the knight was covering the square on e5, right? So once the knight moves away from the center, you can just push your pawn, you're attacking the knight, and the knight has to move. So let's say the knight moves back to e8. Now white has a beautiful attack here. I want you guys to pause this video and find the best move for white. What should white play here? Yes, the best move here for white is to play bishop takes f7 check. Beautiful sacrifice. Now black has two ways to take the bishop. If the rook takes, now we have a nice move by the knight, knight e6, and suddenly this queen gets trapped because this queen cannot move anywhere, and the pawn cannot take the knight because the pawn is pinned. If he takes, we're gonna win the queen and eventually the game. So that's why after knight e6, white is winning in this position. And if instead of a rook takes f7, king takes on f7, now we can play the same move. Knight e6, we are attacking the queen. If the pawn takes, same scenario here. So the king has to take, right? And now we can check on d5, queen d5 check. Very strong move. The king has just one square to escape, which is f5, and now white has 5 move checkmate. So you can push the pawn to g4, the king has to take, and then you get your rook into the attack. And now if the king goes back to f5, you can play rook g5 checkmate, which is a beautiful checkmate. And if the king goes to the other side, so for example, let's say king h4, you can check here. If the king goes to h3, you can checkmate on g2. And if the king goes to h5, you can check here. And if the rook blocks, you can simply take the rook, and this is another beautiful checkmate. Okay, so I hope that you liked this opening trap, which you can use it in your games. Let's move on to the second opening trap in Sicilian Defense, which starts with e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, and let's say if black plays knight f6 here, which is another popular move in such positions. So now you can play knight c3, and let's say black moves the pawn to d6. Now you can move your bishop to c4. This is another way to play this opening. Of course, here you have like other options as well. You can play bishop g5, you can play bishop e2, and you can even play bishop e3. But bishop c4 is a kind of tricky move, I would say, because now if black wants to fianchetto the bishop, let's say if black pushes the pawn to g6, now you can take the knight in c6, pawn takes, and now you can push the pawn to e5. So you are attacking the knight and the pawn. And black might think, okay, this is a free pawn, so why not just taking the pawn? Which is actually not a good idea. The best move here for black is either to move the knight to g4 or knight to d7. But if black takes the pawn on e5, I want you guys to guess the right move for white. What should white play here? Yes, here we're gonna take the pawn on f7 check. The king has to take the bishop, and then we can win the queen on d8, and this is a winning position for white. Okay, let's go back because I want to explain this position a little bit more. As you can see here, the black king is overloaded. Why? Because the king is protecting the queen and the pawn at the same time. So an overloaded piece is actually a disadvantage in chess. You don't want to have, you don't want to be a multitasker in chess, kind of. The pieces. So the king is overloaded, that's why we can take advantage of it by taking the pawn. Of course, we can take the queen as well and then take the pawn f7. We win a pawn, but this is not enough to win the game. But we can change the move orders. So we can take the pawn first, the king cannot move anywhere, the king has to take, and then we can take the queen and win the game. So let's go back and see what happens if black moves the knight to g4. Here you can take the pawn on d6, or you can move the bishop to f4. But there is also a tricky move here, which is pawn to e6. And after e6, black has to play f5, because if black takes the pawn on e6, here white has a winning move. What's a winning move for white? White can take the bishop, and if the pawn takes, notice that the bishop is no longer protecting the knight, so we can just go ahead and win the knight on g4. So a lot of players, especially if you're playing bullet or bullets games, they're afraid to push the pawn to f5. Okay, after f5, it's about equal, and you can play queen d4. In this position, you can attack the rook, and now black either moves the knight back to f6 or rook to g8. And this position is about equal. You can play different moves here. You can move the bishop back, you can castle here, and both sides have chances in this position, but if your opponent takes the pawn, then you can win immediately, and if he takes with the pawn, you can win the knight, but make sure if he pushes the pawn, you need to move your queen. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you are playing Sicilian Defense either as white or as black, please write me in comment section what is your favorite variation in Sicilian Defense. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you soon.